In this video, I'm going to attempt to do a little bit of a review of some of the documents I told you you should study without spending too much time, because I know you probably don't want to watch a long video. I did want to highlight a few things for you, and then of course we're going to spend some time in class answering questions and talking about some of these ideas before the test. The test won't occur until the second part of class, so if you have questions or need something clarified, you can always email me and ask, or we can also talk about it in class. So the study guide that I posted last week walks you through the components of the test. So there isn't anything on the test that's not also on here. Because I think I told you in class, I'm not trying to trick you or get you. I really want to know that you understand backward design and some of the concepts that we've discussed in class already. So if you review your readings, make sure you've read them and look at the guides that I gave you for the readings that highlighted some of the key terms and concepts. If you review those terms and concepts, and you especially pay attention to what's bolded on this sheet, then you should have no problem. And I do mean that, so it'll be okay. There are a mixture of questions on the test. Some are multiple choice, some are short answer. Some have a little bit of an application piece where you'll think about a classroom. But all of it is going to be able to be answered by you if you spend some time reviewing this. So if we look through some of these ideas, pay attention to when I bold something. For example, I said, hint, review the idea of uncoverage. That's because there's a question about uncoverage on the test as related to the Wiggins and McTeague chapter. If we look back at that chapter, uncoverage comes after that first section where in stage 1. So when it says identify the desired results, in stage 1 of backward design, we want to know what should our students know and be able to do by the end of our unit of study. So we say we're starting with the end or beginning with the end because we're looking at where are they going to be at the end of the lesson or the end of the unit. Instead of thinking about the activity first, we're thinking about our goal. What are the desired results? So we have to think about our standards and our objectives. What is guiding us, not an activity, but our goals or our objectives are guiding us. And part of that process in stage 1, so we see stage 1, we identify the desired results. And then stage 2, we determine, okay, what's the acceptable evidence? So what are our assessments going to look like? What's going to show us that we've achieved what the students should be able to know and do? How are we going to know that they can do that? That's our assessment, and that comes in stage 2. And then stage 3, that's when we finally get to do the fun part, I think, which is plan the lesson and the learning experiences that are going to lead us to these things. But if we scroll down and still in the stage 1 section, you'll see right here it talks about uncoverage. So the idea of uncoverage is that when we're talking about big ideas or concepts, students often will come with misconceptions, and we have to consider what those misconceptions are. So hopefully you'll anticipate that a little bit, so you'll know that, okay, whatever I'm teaching, I'm going to think about it. What might a learner think about that? And what could they possibly think that would be a misconception prior to learning about it? And for example, the example in here talks about in physics, students frequently struggle with the ideas concerning gravity, force, and motion. So the authors say, and I think you probably can imagine this happening, if you're holding two things up in the air, a lot of times, paper or a ball, if you drop it and you say which one's going to hit the ground first, they're often going to choose the one that's heavier because they think it'll go faster and hit first. So that's a misconception. So you can anticipate that they're probably going to guess that because they have that misconception about gravity and force in motion. So that's what they're talking about with uncoverage, is what are some of those misconceptions the students might have, and how can you uncover that? And one of those ways is to do pre-assessments. So I can assess my students prior to beginning a unit, and I can see what are some misconceptions that they have, and then I can address those because I can build in maybe some extra support if needed. Maybe if only a few students have misconceptions that they need to be cleared before we go on with the study, or I can build those into my lessons. But just any kind of pre-assessment, doesn't always have to be a test, but just questions you ask at the beginning of a lesson that kind of let you see where the students are and allow you to uncover ideas that they may already be struggling with. And then also, it allows you to just activate that prior knowledge and get them started thinking. And we saw that with our Fishes Fish video, or not video, there's a video of it, but we looked at the book, where our fish had misconceptions about what people, cows, and birds look like because he was attaching his own experiences to those pictures in his mind. And so those were misconceptions that the frog had to uncover by doing something that would support him. Maybe, having a pre-assessment or having him draw those pictures, with his little fishy fins. But something so that the frog knew that he had those misconceptions. Be able to describe the steps and sequence of backward design. So there I gave it to you. We start with the standard. We think about, so that would be in stage 1. We think about then what evidence is going to show us that the students have achieved that standard. So that's our assessment. So normally we think of assessment as being the end, but in backward design, it's at the beginning. When we craft it, we make it up. Then we have to think of our mastery objectives, which we talked about last week. Mastery objectives are those more specific objectives, the actual what we're doing in the lesson, where the standard is broader. Then we think about what the instructional methods are and the learning activities. So we know with backward design that the actual activities that we're planning come last in our process of planning. We don't start with activity. That comes last because first we start with what we want our students to be able to know and do. Then we think about how will we know that they know and can do those things. And then finally at the very end we think about, okay, now what activity can we do to get them to that point? And I've said this several times, the fun part for me is the end, is getting to that. Make sure you look at this establishing curricular priorities diagram. So if you go back to the reading and it's above the uncoverage right here. So when we think about, if you review the Wiggins article and you're thinking about big ideas or enduring understandings, those central ideas that are transferable to other content areas or transferable to other things in our life. They are real world type bigger ideas, whereas important things to know and do are more specific to the content area, things worth being familiar with are not as important, but the big ideas, they're the core. This is what if I were to leave the unit, I would hope to have that big idea, that concept that can travel with me. The continuum of assessment, I said hint, make sure you pay attention to performance tasks. So if you look at the continuation of assessment, that is a little bit further down in the article right here. So the authors say that these go from more simple on the left side to more complex on the right side. So these informal checks for understanding, that might be if I pull up Plickers, for those of you who've already taken 110, 510, scan the room real quick and I just kind of see where everyone is. Or I'm walking around and I'm just listening into what groups are talking about. Or bending down and talking to someone and seeing what they say. Those are informal checks for understanding that probably aren't going to show up in my grade book, but I still am getting a sense of where my students are. And then as we move up this continuum, they get a little more complex. And notice that a quiz or a test is not the most complex, but that a performance task is. And so that's what I want you to pay attention to in the reading. And if you scroll down a little bit, it tells you more about what performance tasks are. And it also tells you right here, the performance tasks call for application. So rather than just recall or just memorizing a fact, instead I have to apply whatever I learned either into a new situation or to solve a problem, like a real world type problem. Or I might relate it to other content areas. So if you look here, I might have to look at a specific audience. So maybe I'm acting like a scientist and my audience is other scientists and I have to share my findings about something rather than doing a test where it's multiple choice. Allow the students greater opportunity to personalize, so this is a chance for you to bring in interests. A real setting or a simulated setting, a lot of times performance tasks are similar to problem-based learning, and in that instance, that's where you might present a problem to the students and then they have to solve it, and by solving it they are learning about the throughout the unit and able to give solutions. So for example, when I taught 5th grade, we were doing a unit on geometry, and I can't remember exactly what I posed as the problem, but it was something that our principal needed done at the school. And the only way that he could get it done was with our help. But we had to learn some of these concepts about angles and different geometric figures and some measurement, area and perimeter, and a bunch of stuff was thrown in to be able to solve this problem for him. And to make it a little more real, I had him come in and present it. So, he came in during our math time and he said, Miss Walker's class, I really need your help. I want to do this in the school, and now I can't remember exactly. I think it might have been something with the playground. But I need your help because I know you're studying angles, and I know, and these geometric figures and measurement, perimeter and area, and I think that you can help me with this. And so this is what I want you to do. And he posed the problem, and they got really excited about it. That was like a hook. And then throughout the unit, our end goal was to solve this problem for him and to offer him a solution. But the only way we could do that was by learning about all the things we needed to be able to solve the problem. So that would be similar to a performance task where the students are engaging in this problem, that they're applying what they learned to be able to solve it. And it's more real world. It says it might mirror issues and problems faced by adults that are authentic, just like someone who is trying to build something, they've got to know these things to be able to do it, and that's kind of what we were doing with that unit. So think of this as being bigger, more complex application, not just recall or memorization, but everything I'm learning is leading up to me being able to do this task that feels real. Okay, so in your other readings, that nested egg graphic that we talked about the other week, or the last time we were together, talking about the mastery objectives. So, and I put a hint here, we know that standards are bigger, and that mastery objectives are more specific, and they're more achievable in one lesson, where a standard might cover many lessons. And the ones that you've looked at sometimes have the standard on the left, and then on the right or underneath the standard you see more specific objectives, and that would be like a mastery objective, something that's achievable in the lesson. And then we said that like the 4 M's, it's measurable, so we can assess it, we can know if the students can do it. It's manageable, we can do it within the lesson, it's not too big. It's made first, so we know like backward design, it comes when we're planning and we're creating the objective, it comes before we plan the activity. And most important, so it's something the students need to know, it's not just fluff. It's something that is something part of the pacing guide, the standards, what you're supposed to achieve in that grade, and is applicable to them as a student, and not just something that you think you thought up for fun. And then think about mastery objectives versus coverage, activity, and involvement. Make sure you review the terms in Teach Like a Champion. So we looked at some of those when we did that sticky note activity. So you think back to that day. Think back in Chapter 7 to these strategies for participation and getting students to share ideas in class. Specifically think about wait time, because there might be a question about wait time. But then there's also a question about all 4 of these and how these kind of work together to get students to participate more and to get students to think more and maybe up the rigor in the types of questions you ask. Which I think he talked a little bit about that sometimes being hard, because when you ask a question, I still experience this, and you get everyone's just blankly staring at you. Sometimes that time that you're just waiting there is uncomfortable, and you want to fill the space and just go ahead and tell them the answer, or just skip over it and go to something else, and it might feel uncomfortable, and so you have to learn to wait and give them opportunities to talk to each other and to think about it, and wait for more hands to come up, or so think about all of the ways he talked about how you could encourage more participation during that wait time. And then there'll be a question about that. The Name the Steps protocol we briefly looked at. That's this one. And it comes from our readings. We start with the standard. We think about what we want the students to know and be able to do. So this is very similar to that, this one right here. But this is obviously briefer than this. Think about our assessment. What's it going to look like at the end? Are you going to do a performance assessment, or is it going to be a test? Summative assessment are those larger assessments that usually count for a grade, like a test or a performance task, a project, something that's really going to show you what the students know and are able to do. Think about the objectives for each lesson, so they're more specific. Those mastery objectives are more specific than the big standard. think about what's essential, what's important for them to know. Think about what, budgeting your time. If you're talking about, if we go back to the Constitution, so 5th grade, they have to analyze important documents that shape the nation. Well, we could spend an entire year talking about the Constitution. I mean, it is so complex, and there's so much we'd have to sift through, but that is not the goal of this. So what of the Constitution should I think about? What's important for them to know? What's nice for them to know? So what out of those two, important to know obviously is going to win out. And then if I have a little more time, I could sprinkle in some of the things that are nice to know, but they don't have to know. Select the activities that will align with the objectives. That's something we're going to talk more about this as we look at the lesson planning template. But the idea is that just that this doesn't come at the beginning, it comes a little bit later. Then those formative assessments you'll think about as you're planning the activities. So the summative in backward design comes first. But those formative assessments, those are the checks for understanding. The things that you do if you do plickers, or if you, you walk around the room and listen, or they do a ticket out the door, or an exit ticket as the mom calls it. So those are those little checks that you'll embed in the lesson that you create. Then you'll start writing your lesson plans. Then you'll teach your lesson, and of course you'll reflect on your lesson and see what you can change. And those are the things that we're going to talk more about. Okay? So I'm going to keep going because I know this is already getting long. Review the lesson plan terms, which I also have up. Now this was a fill-in-the-blank document that we didn't get to fill in, so I'm going to briefly go through this. We know that a standard comes from the Common Core or Central Standards, and there's some new standards that have been passed that might replace Common Core, but we know the standard is larger. It is what we want them to know and be able to do, but it's broader, not as specific as the mastery objective. Mastery objectives are derived from the standard. So the standard's larger, and we're going to pull it out of there. Explains what the student should be able to know and do by the end of today's lesson. To move closer to mastery of the overall standard, it should be manageable, measurable, made first, and most important. So that's those 4 M's that Lamov talks about. Sometimes you'll see it as an I can statement, especially in schools. You also refer to it as a learning outcome. But that's the idea is this is what I want my students to be able to know and do by the end of my lesson. Materials and resources, that's self-explanatory. Those are the things you need for your lesson. We talked a little bit about prior knowledge last time we were together when we read the Fish's Fish book. It describes the knowledge that students need in order to access today's lesson. So prior to coming to today's lesson, what do they already know? What are all the things that they know? And what do they need to be able to activate in their brains? So when it says activate prior knowledge, that's the time at the beginning of the lesson when you get them started thinking about the concept and you kind of refresh their memory and see what they know. And so then their little brains are starting to say, okay, I remember that. Let me apply everything I know to what I'm about to learn. They might draw on experiences and knowledge outside of the school. So we know our fish did that. He was pulling in some of his experiences, things he knew. He put gills on the people and the cows and the birds because he knew that's what you need to breathe. But he didn't know that other things breathe in different ways. So sometimes teachers surface questions or confusion, questions, misconceptions. or confusion by activating prior knowledge. So that is that uncoverage stage. So when earlier in the video we talked about uncoverage, when you are activating that prior knowledge, and like the fish, those pictures are happening in the student's mind and they have some misconceptions. That's that time during uncoverage. Sometimes you can do this through a do now. Maybe the warm up is kind of activating their prior knowledge. Maybe the warm up is the frog says to the fish, "Draw what you think a cow looks like." And then the frog can see, "Oh, that's what he thinks the cow looks like. Okay, now I need to tailor my lesson to make sure that he really understands what a cow looks like." Your main learning activities. So this is when this is all the detail, the bulk of your lesson, the big part. This is when you talk about the sequence, what you're going to do throughout the lesson, the different strategies that you might use. And then it says when teachers transition between activities, they often need to give specific directions to students to facilitate it. Or so they, I guess, transition or move between activities. So that's something that we'll talk more about when we're together. Then at the end of the lesson, you'll have closure. You'll bring it all back together. So a summarizer might be the last few minutes of the lesson and ask the students to really think about, okay, what did we do today? What was the purpose of it? We can connect back to the mastery objective. So it might be the last few sentences a teacher says. It can be part of an exit ticket, but it's just that moment where I kind of wrap it all up. I provide closure. I remind them this was the purpose of the lesson, and then they kind of neatly tie it with a bow. Okay, this is why we did this. Pre-assessments allow us to see what our students know prior to us teaching it. Pre-assessments are usually not graded, or they don't count for a grade. They're more for our information. Formative assessments are ongoing assessments that teachers use. They're not graded necessarily. Sometimes they are graded, but they don't count as a large grade. They give us data. They're informal. And as it says here, it's either ungraded or it's just a small grade. It's like a check for understanding. Summative assessments are usually larger grades. They might be at the end of a unit, usually are at the end of a unit. They might be a project, a test. They're structured. They're usually announced in advance. Sometimes they have rubrics. They count toward the student's overall progress. And they show the student's overall progress toward mastery of the standards. Summative assessments are usually high point values. Academic language, those are important terms the students need to use to communicate within discipline. So it gives you some math examples, it gives you some English language arts examples, it gives you some science and social studies examples. Those are those vocabulary words that they're content specific. Differentiated instruction, I think we've talked about briefly, but this is something that you'll continue to think about throughout the program. And it's not something that is just simple. It is something I think even in practicing teachers are still trying to figure out. But this is the time when I'm considering the different learning needs of my students. And I'm trying to plan for those learning needs within my lesson. And not think of it as an afterthought, but plan for it while, it's part of my lesson. While I'm planning, I'm considering what are the needs of these different learners in the room. So differentiated instruction is embedded in instruction during a lesson to meet the needs of particular students. So, for example, I might have a support built in that addresses a particular student with an IEP, or I might have a support that's built in that addresses a group of students, like all of my English language learners. Maybe I offer visuals for the vocabulary to support my English language learners. It's ongoing, or it's lesson specific. It changes, it varies. You might group the students in different ways, and that's an example of differentiation. You might provide them vocabulary support. You might provide visuals. You might provide audio, a video. You know, there are just so many ways. There's no right answer to differentiated instruction, but there are many right answers. So it's all the different ways that you support the different learners in your room. Okay, so let's look at our study guide. Go back over the standards, focus on that PowerPoint that's in that last folder, the session 3. Focus especially on your parts that apply to you. Think about, I said think about a formative assessment, and I said that just as a hint, there is a question about formative assessment, that it's ongoing. It's not summative. Summative would be the end or the larger project. Formative assessment you're always doing. Because even if you don't have a piece of paper write anything down, you're still listening to what your students are saying, and in your head, you're making decisions about instruction. Because if no one in the class is able to answer your question, then in your head you're automatically revising where you're going next, because you know that they need more time with whatever you just asked because no one got it right. That's a formative assessment. And maybe it was just a question you asked orally, or maybe you had them do an exit ticket and you looked at the answers and you thought, okay, well, I've got to talk about this again tomorrow because I can tell that the majority of the class still is struggling with it. That's a formative assessment. So you might not necessarily put the exit ticket grade in your grade book, but it's going to guide your instruction for the next day. That's formative assessment. Okay, so that was a lot and a long video and a lot of rambling, but I hope that it helped you key in on some of the important concepts for our test. Please let me know if you have questions. Go back through the readings, go back through those key terms, and most of it, unless I bolded it, you don't really need to memorize it, but you do need to understand those key terms. You need to be able to really think about that nested egg. Think about the steps to backward design, not the big document, but this idea right here. Begin with the standard, and then all the way the activities are at the end. If you can remember this, then you'll be good. Okay? So let me know if you have questions, and then you can email me, or we can talk about it in class at the beginning of class next week.